Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Bands of Time. We have some very important information that we're bringing forward to everybody here tonight, and I know that there's been a lot of excitement through some discourse with some of our listeners privately here, and a lot of anticipation concerning what it is that we're about to bring forward into the light tonight. Now, last weekend when we had done that program on the Battle for Nineveh Part 2, we had stated in there that I had already spent time locking everything in and already had a conclusion. Now, as everybody probably took note of, we did not release this on the next day, and to be thoroughly honest, that was absolutely for the best. Because throughout the entirety of this course of this last week, there was a lot of things that had hit me early in the week that I had needed to sit down and reevaluate, and most notably, the biggest riddle of them all concerning this whole topic is those rivers. You know, I haven't touched the Tigris and Euphrates. I don't really see any reason to look in that direction right now. But as far as we've discussed, a little bit here, we've discussed the river Gihon, what is also referred to in the Greek text as the Oxus. But Pison itself was actually one of the most major factors in locking this in. And this is the river itself and this land of Havilah that has had a multitude of people just absolutely baffled here throughout the ages. And without having that proper location, without having the proper location for Havilah, it was really leaving me in this circumstance, in this predicament of being able to triangulate, but having the issue of one missing river. You cannot properly set a destination if you don't have those 4 points. Without having that fourth point, I was sitting in a spot of a great big what if. When dealing with something such as this, you cannot be sitting in a spot of what if. You have to have an absolute. And it took me some considerable time to lock in this last and final river. And it gets very, very interesting once you begin to realize where it is that the land of Havilah actually is. And even more so as I went and looked even further today before we started recording this, before we set up our prep time, went in and looked to see where does the etymology of this word come from. And lo and behold, you end up finding out that this was in Babylonian cuneiform. And what that means is this is actually a very ancient name that has been used for this very specific region. So to me, that it really helped to completely and absolutely cement this place in. And this just gets even more fascinating once you begin to realize everything that is going on with this very specific location. Now we're going to start moving into this at a bit of a rapid speed, but I'm going to let Matthew step in here because there is some few topics we need to touch on beforehand. There's been some recent events that we need to really quickly highlight before we move into this, folks.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have got all kinds of things swirling in the world around us. Going to include hurricanes, I guess. But there are many things going on and around the world that Brian and I certainly do need to address. You know, it's amazing to me that even today my son asked me an off-the-wall question out of the maelstrom itself. He noticed that in a lot of the major iconography, in portraits painted of certain individuals translating the Bible, there was always a skull close at hand while he was translating. So much information to talk about. We have events going on prophetically that's just off the charts that Brian and I should really discuss out in the open, but the real crux about this is getting back to the beginning, like Brian said, trying to ascertain, trying to triangulate the location first therein mentioned in the book of Genesis. the origin point, the event horizon for civilization itself, if we can't come to terms with this, all else is for naught. All else is a waste of time, because we are told that the end can only be perceived from the beginning. So with that in mind, Brian's going to just shoot off the headlines. He lined up the headlines. He's going to read them to you. And I know that the Christian academic entertainment industry is wanting you to look everywhere else, especially with this this political nonsense going on. So Brian's just going to shoot out some headlines to you, and we're just going to let that set there. We're just going to let that ferment, shall we say. You know, just tonight, ladies and gentlemen, Brian asked me to look into the Greek, look into the etymology. Well, he was way out there in left field, and at the same time, I just kept my mouth quiet. I looked and I saw what the Septuagint was doing, where it was going. So I haven't even had a chance to share that with him. So I guess you're going to get it at the same time that he does. But ladies and gentlemen, please try to remember that Brian and I cover both the Hebrew and the Greek. That's going to probably confuse, well, we might as well just say all of you. If you have Western origins, that's just going to confuse you. But it's pretty important what God has done in his word. He was symbolically sending you somewhere else, which is absolutely amazing. So, Brian, why don't you rattle off those headlines and just kind of let that lay. Let's get right to the text at hand, I think. But everybody does need to be brought up to speed, at least in a little blurb. The things that are going on right now as we do this. We just don't have time to cover that right now. And so that everybody can have something to think about, so that they might renew their mind, as the New Testament says, because I'm sure that all of our listeners are just getting bombarded with two names. Both names are absolutely and unequivocally irrelevant. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist that figure out that your vote is not even counted. It's electoral votes that vote in the executive chief officer. So we're not going to mention those names because none of that stuff is important. But the headlines Brian's going to give you, you need to renew your mind and flush all that stuff about the elections out. Just flush your brain. Just flush those two names out. Get rid of them. And think about what's going on right now that is important. So, Brian, back to you.
UNESCO says Jews have no connection to Temple Mount. UN passed a resolution Thursday denying the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. Analyst, Russia is ready for war. U.S.-Russia instability to do right in Syria may be a symptom of a bigger problem, analysts say. RAF given green light to shoot down hostile Russian jets in Syria. Russia orders all officials to fly home. Any relatives living abroad as tension mount over the prospect of a global war. Report Israel to purchase new German submarines targeting Iran and Syria.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, as you can tell from those headlines, there's really important things going on, and we didn't even mention some of the news that I looked at today about pensions. I just did a search for retirement pensions and cuts in the news, and I just got scores of them. Different towns, different municipalities. It's getting ready to whack them. Several unions were pretty upset because I guess different unions are getting ready to have their pensions whacked as well. So we have important stuff going on the ground. So you need to take those two names that I referred to earlier and just flush them out of your mind. They don't matter. What is going to happen has already been planned since the foundation of the earth was laid. And tonight, like I said, that's where we're going to go back to. We're going to go back to the beginning and triangulate just exactly where the infamous Havilah may be. The origin of those four rivers, the event horizon as to where this all started. And take note, ladies and gentlemen, that I do want to say this. The only cherubim stationed outside the throne room of the living God is facing a direction. That's probably pretty important, whether you ever thought about that or not. God doesn't waste his words. When he tells you something, especially concerning a direction, you probably should realize that that's of magnificent importance. So, with that in mind, let's get back to Genesis, shall we? Let's get back to the beginning, because it is only from that point of origin that God says we can see the end. You can only see it from the beginning. That being said, let's get to the crux of this, and let us just remember that old infamous phrase from the Elizabethan government authorized translation of the Bible. Thou wast in the garden of God.
The Lord God planted a garden towards the east, in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight, and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pison. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. The beryl and the onyx stones are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows out of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Now, the first thing to point out here right away, everybody, because this does really become crucial in unlocking this Eden. As you can take note of right here in the Hebrew, in Genesis 2 verse 8, we have the word spelled in this way. We have a bet right in front of this. And the same goes here with Ezekiel 28 verse 13. And let's read that really quickly, because Ezekiel 28:13, in more ways than one, is a crucial key in unlocking the entirety of everything here. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold, the workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you on the day that you were created. They were prepared. Now I want everybody to commit Ezekiel 28:13 to memory, because when we explain some commonly held misconceptions concerning this chapter, this is really going to begin to highlight the absolute importance of this. Now, as I stated, the most important river in unlocking the whole of this actually ended up being the very first river and that land of Havilah. The name of the first is Pison. It flows around the whole land of Havilah where there is gold. Now you're going to end up finding out that, interestingly enough, we have in Afghanistan, its modern name is now Herat. And Herat dates back to ancient times, but the exact age remains unknown. During the period in the Achaemenid Empire from 550 to 330 BC, the surrounding district was known as Hariva. In Old Persian, the classical sources, the region was correspondingly known as Ar-E-A or Eria. And everybody take note of that as well, because we've spoken at length about that in the past when we brought up what was happening there at the time of Darius the Great and what it is that he proclaimed that he was. He stood up on that Pison inscription and stated that I am an Aryan from the land of Eria. Well, folks, this is that land of Eria that he was referring to. So that does become very important all of a sudden. Now, I just want to kind of stop here and point out this is where, folks, you need to understand something when you're dealing with ancient historical text. When we are looking at what we have written down, we are dealing with one side of the story. And when we pay attention sometimes to these texts, some very revealing things will come forward. I was looking over the work of a professor in his course that he was teaching, a very broad course on history itself, and I did have to find it ironic that the way he explained this, he stopped and pointed out the Pison inscription itself from Darius the Great. And you do have to chuckle at the fact of what he highlighted. He goes out of his way to say, Darius goes out of his way to say that there was rebellions that arose in Armenia, and I smote them by the might of Ahura Mazda, and they were no more. Then in the next line, it happens again. He smote them, and they were no more. And then it happens again. He smote them, and they were no more. Folks, if you smite somebody and they're no more, logic dictates they're not going to keep coming back. So when you begin to look at quote-unquote propaganda being used by a king, you've got probably one of your most colorful and even, at least in my mind, humorous depictions right there on that Pison inscription alone. And look, folks, you have to understand that. We have a lot of people that want to quote from certain historians and say, well, this is the absolute fact of the matter. Okay. The stretch and the reach of these historians only goes so far. Some of these people were having to rely on information that was passed along to them. We don't step in here. We don't say, well, Josephus was the absolute authority. Herodotus was the absolute authority. Tacitus was the absolute authority. We can go with this for days and years on end. Okay? The Bible is the absolute authority. Anything beyond that, then we know we have a contradiction and a problem. That means we need to look deeper. And that's where it is that when we start having a plethora of archaeological material coming forward, not to even mention text coming to light that rewrites history as we know it, that's why it gets very important to continue to look at all this stuff. But let us not negate the work that was done back in the 1800s. As everybody has become full well apparent of, the 1800s, there was a whole lot going on, and they brought forward so much of this material, it gets frightening. Now, going back into this. Now, once again, classical sources of this region correspondingly to Arya. I covered that. In the Zoroastrian Avesta, which let me point out this real fast, folks, this was penned. Their usual dates that they put this into is 200 AD, moving anywhere up into around 1300 AD. A lot of this stuff was put down at the time that the Huns were coming into that region. So the Avesta is it's not near as old as most people think it is, nor is it as has been commonly taught for some odd reason for so many years now. It's ridiculous that it's one of the oldest religions on earth. That contradicts everything that has come to light concerning the archaeological and historical documentation that is now known to modern scholarship. So we need to erase that concept from our minds because it's not true. I'm sorry, folks, that I know everybody's heard this forever on end. I personally believe this was done intentionally. If they could do this, they were able to erase some very important people concerning the East. So let us move forward here. Now, the name of this district and its main town is derived from the chief river of the region, Hariva, Old Darya Hariyan, which means silken water, which transverses the district and passes some 5 kilometers, 3.1 miles south of modern Herat. Harai is mentioned in Sanskrit as yellow or golden in color, equivalent to the Persian zard, meaning gold or yellow. The name of the region and its principal town after the main river is a common feature in this part of the world, comparing the adjoining districts of rivers towns of Arcosia and Bactria. Now we're going to step over here once again back into, apparently this one came from 1919. This is in a book that you can freely find online. I've included the links right here in this text, starting at, I'm just going to jump down here to page 187. The full note is actually from 186 and page 187. Within what is left here of this PDF, they have posted freely online, which in here, it's page 14. I've been finding cut in half documents lately. All right, the first of those in the name of the city in the form of Hopoki, Hatarai, Bigarasanti. The first two elements, Harbois, correspond to an old Persian Hariva, Babylonian Hariva, Avestan Hariva, Pavali, Hebrew Aramean Haru, the modern Herat. So as we can see right here, there's a few other little odds and ends here. We have the Sogdian mountain comes into this, etc. Now, you look into some of this other documentation that's been brought forward since the 1800s and even moving forward, you're going to find out, as I stated, this was from a Babylonian cuneiform text. Okay, at the time of the Chaldean Babylonian Empire, they were not using cuneiform any longer, folks. So this is the name for this region that corresponds to the very, very ancient times, going back to the root of writing itself. So this is its original name. So now all of a sudden we can see we've got this region of Havilah. It's now sitting right in front of us. All right, everybody. I have just zoomed it in now to Afghanistan. This is Herat. This is the exact name that now that we have seen through the archaeological findings going back to ancient Babylon. This is the place that is referred to as Havilah. And this is where I'm going to have Matthew now slide in with the Greek that he decided not to tell me. So this should be rather interesting, everybody.
Exactamundo, ladies and gentlemen. When you take a look at what the Septuagint does, or the Greco side of the Bible, Brian was asking me this in relationship to this Havilah, of course, in the Hebrew, this H2341. When I looked at it and I brought up the Septuagint, it said something altogether different. It said Avalat. It takes somebody that knows what they're looking for. And I realized what it was that God did. This, ladies and gentlemen, has nothing to do with Havilah. Nothing at all. What God did was take a different Hebrew word altogether. You know this as Eloth, of course, or some translations have Elat, as a place there, an Israeli place there by the Red Sea. You know that as H359. The problem is that word actually means trees, or grove of trees, more specifically. So the place name in Hebrew Whenever they say that, of course, there's instances in the Bible where this term is used where it's under great debate as to whether he was talking about a place name or if he meant that he was restoring the gardens or the grove of trees. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what the Septuagint actually does. That is a transliteration of H359 and the root therein. The root, of course, is H352. But that's what the Septuagint uses instead of Havilah in Hebrew. But yet I know what that aleph means. I know it means garden. I know it means grove. I know that. So when we go back to the beginning, you realize that God is trying to magnify something very important to you, because let us go back to the beginning. Why is all this important? Why must these kings come from the east? Why? Why is this place so important? Of course, Genesis, the 3rd chapter in verse 24, we all know what it says. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. So when you see that God was intentionally, he was going out of his way to use this specific word so you would know, you would have to be able to see out with both eyes. You would have to see out of one eye in Hebrew and out of one eye in Greek. And when I looked at it, Brian brought that up. He goes, well, I need you to work on this etymology for Havilah. And I looked at it, switched it over to the Septuagint, and it says, well, why does that say alavat? Wait a minute. That's a translation for another word for garden. But ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand, the Septuagint in the Hebrew does this all the time. If God is intentionally going to keep something in the dark, well, Brian just mentioned it earlier. Herodotus is only relevant when he speaks as God has spoken. So he is only the authority when what comes out of his mouth lines up with what the Bible has stated already. The same with Josephus. The same with them all, lock, stock, and barrel. Brian and I was just talking the other day about all the keys that lied in the hands of Delich, the first and foremost Assyrianologist ever. Most of what we know about Assyria came from that particular scholar. Of course, you've heard that name before, but not in reference to the Assyrians. Of course, it was his father that gave us the Hebrew Bible source code by the way of his biblical translation of the New Testament. So with that in mind, I hope you realize how many times I've spoken, and you could only hear with only one ear. You could only hear the Hebrew, hear the Greek. Ladies and gentlemen, you can ask Brian. He just asked me that when he was prepping the mic and the video and getting the program right. He didn't ask me this till 5 minutes before we went on air. And I looked at it and I didn't have to say anything. I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, what he did was gave you the place name of something else, expecting you to realize, well, it's not the place name, my children. It's the meaning of that place name. So when we look at it in that light. We realize that in this instance, going back to the beginning is of critical importance. And Brian and I have showed you that just using the English translations. Why is it that what cuts down God's axe? Remember, God is quite clear he only has one axe. That is the Assyrian. You are promised that once God uses him, God is quite clear to make sure that you know that some other force ravages his land. And the whole time it was setting right in front of our face. That's why they had to come from the east. That's why, of course, the mighty cherubim was stationed to the east of Eden, guarding the way. That's why when you take a look at this on Google Earth, you just have to shake your head when you realize where Noah's North Pole and South Pole is, where North is going to be. It makes everything God has said, when sometimes he's referred to north and then said south, or other times when he hasn't mentioned the west at all, yet he mentions east. He's letting you know something. He's encoded it to you for a reason. When he uses the phrase, the land in the midst of the rivers, well, ladies and gentlemen, the end can only be seen from the beginning. Symbolically, he is naturally, prophetically referring to the very first 4 rivers. You're expected to know that. That not only is he giving you stuff in Greek, and not only is he giving you stuff in Hebrew, yes, he's telling you, you go to the corner of First Street and Center Street. He's also expecting you to know that he said center and first before. So when he says the land in the midst of the rivers, of course he's talking about the mighty Assyrian, his axe. But he's also prophetically expecting you to realize, go back to the beginning in order to see the end. Ah, yes, those 4 rivers, those 4 points, north, south, east, and west. Direction was not altogether the same at the event horizon, but we'll get back to the days of Noah soon enough. In me saying that, did that take you by surprise? I know that all the other so-called, and I do not say that lightly, I really do mean that with my whole heart, these so-called eschatology experts that want you to think that going back to the days of Noah is just surrounding the events occurring between the wicked at the present time. No, 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 no. When God says you're going back to the days of Noah, he's speaking literally, he's speaking prophetically, and he's certainly speaking geographically. So when you realize what God was just doing right there, by letting you see a different word, and you realize that's not what the Septuagint was transliterating. Remember, God does it all the time. He transliterates, and then other times he translates. In this instance, he transliterated a different word, but if you didn't know Hebrew, you wouldn't be able to see what he was referring to. That was important. The scourge of God, the flail of God. The kings from the east are going to do exactly what they have done before. They're coming from the exact same event horizon that they came from before. Like Brian stated, it's simply a matter of fact that is why this particular king thought it so pertinent to put upon this inscription where he was from. He was telling the entire world, past, present, and future, I come from Eden. This is my claim to all authority. I come from Eden. Therefore, no matter where he was from, it was irrelevant. Once everybody in the ancient world saw that, they knew what he was talking about. And by the way, just so you know, that's the whole reason why he told you that twice. He was an Aryan from Arian. And that's why he kept repeating himself. And they were no more. He was trying to tell you that these things were isochronal, not linear. In phrasing things this way on that Pison inscription, I just look at it and it is a riddle in stone. I knew exactly what he meant. He was telling you that because I was from this place, I and my sons would always carry jurisdiction here, there, and everywhere we go. With that in mind, I'll read this one more time. This is why these kings that do this must come from the east. This is why. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. So he drove out the man and placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and the flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. That's what's on that Pison inscription, actually. You just have to have eyes that can see and ears that can hear. And of course, that's why this place, ladies and gentlemen, that's why this place was used by Alexander the Great. That's why this very town that Brian referred you to, in late 330 BC, Alexander the Great, according to his biographers, captured this place, renamed it. Alexander renamed this place Alexandria Arnia. But anyway, he was intending on making this the Aryan capital. This is, of course, the source for this is, of course, Ptolemy. So when you realize that, now wait a minute, why would this king that was not Greek, no, that's not, Alexander the Great's got nothing to do with the Pison inscription. This particular grandiose king wanted you to know that he was using the term that this place was named after as a region. That's where this city was. So with that in mind, I hope everybody realizes just how important it is that we look into the kings of the East. That's why we're doing yet another one on this series. Because, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we don't know why God has said certain things. You just have to swallow and accept it and then try to go about understanding it. And in order to understand it, you first have to believe it. And this is what he said, that you can only see the end from the beginning. All these things are tied together right there, and he's expecting you to know who, what, where, when, why. Those answers come in both Hebrew and Greek, but you're expected to know that up front. So with that in mind, I hope everybody realizes the importance of these things. Hope you realize it's important that we look and understand and be able to prepare. Look to this very region and realize that when you look at it on Google Earth, it would be the perfect place to not only stage, but to train vast and mighty army. Absolutely amazing.
All right, folks, and the only thing we can do here is to keep moving forward. There's just so much here to cover, and there is no possible way in just this preview that we can touch on everything. Now, the next part of this gets important on top of it, because now you have the river itself. Matthew pointed out the relevant details there. There's actually things that we are going to need to touch on when we move forward. Alexander the Great here, everybody. I'm going to tell you this right now. Every single aspect in detail, what was going through that man's head, all the new findings, all of this is going to become very important, because the entire reason why I was able to lock back onto everything was because of Alexander and everything that he did when he went through this entire region. So let us move forward. We'll touch on that afterwards. All right, now we have the river. The Hare River, Old Dari Hariud, Silken River, which transverses the district and passes some 3.1 miles south of modern Herat. Hare is mentioned in Sanskrit as yellow or golden, equivalent to the Persian zard, meaning gold or yellow. Okay, and I already read that before, but I wanted to amplify it again here so I can slide in Google Earth. And this is something that is really important when we actually do this, because we have to actually have these sources for these rivers so that we can lock this in. And that's a little trickier than you would think. There's been extensive work that's been done over time here tracing the source of the Gihon. But the work that they did actually traced out the new source, because the old source was actually cut off by an earthquake in the 1900s, and the river did what it did. It changed course, and the source water is now in a different location. So it was actually good that I caught that, because I had the old one locked in. Now, as you can see here, I have this highlighted in Google Earth. This is the source of that river that I had just mentioned previously. This is the source of the Pison, and my spelling. So now we have that locked in. And I think maybe it's time we stop and just talk for a moment here about Afghanistan itself, because I'm telling you this right now, folks, I never expected this. I did not see this last week. I never saw this coming. And at first glance, it wouldn't make sense. But I mean, let us stop and consider something here, everybody. How prominent has Afghanistan been in current events? Current events actually stretching back to the time of Iran when I was a child, back in the 1980s. I believe it was even 1979. I remember actually, for some very odd reason, my mom making blueberry pancakes and sausage as we were watching everything that was unfolding on the news. This was always a moment in my life that for some reason that memory just embedded itself in my mind. I never realized why then. But this was at one of the pivot points in history where everything was happening already with Afghanistan. Things were happening with Pakistan. We had on top of it, we had things taking place with Afghanistan with the border of Russia. And this is where there is a major amount of just some extremely important archaeological finds that have come forward that they do not have enough material on, because nobody's been able to go into these areas and get in there and do archaeological digs. This man that did the documentary on Alexander's Lost World, David Adams, he goes in there, and luckily enough, he was actually allowed to go into some of these territories that they have never opened up to anybody outside of the regions outside of Afghanistan and the people that live there. And as he points out several different times in this documentary, there are actually places that he discovered when he was out that would probably be some of the greatest archaeological finds in history, going back to even at the point in time when Schliemann found Troy. So when you see this documentary and you see the films and of everything that he brings forward in this, folks, this is why I've said it's It'll cost you $24 on Amazon to get a digital version of the documentary. Don't steal it. This man deserves every cent for the 6 months of his life just filming alone that he put into this. There's so much there that is so crucial that everybody understands. Now, how is it that Afghanistan could be known for gold? How could they be known for all these other precious stones that are listed there? Well, we need to go back to some of the most ancient depictions of certain even Greek mythologies that really start to legendary texts, and on top of it, these were texts that inspired Alexander the Great to do what he did. There's ancient versions of the story of Jason and the Argonauts that actually gives you quite a few other details that really unlock understanding what was going through Alexander the Great's mind and charting his course up into Afghanistan and through that whole region. He knew that first he had to find the ancient river, which was known as the Phasis. Now, this one has been a very difficult river to lock in for a multitude of reasons. There's so many varying descriptions of it in various Greek texts that it is almost impossible to lock down. You'll get a lot of ideas within variants of that Jason and the Argonauts story that you'll somehow come to the conclusion of Medea being in Colchis in Georgia, but that's not what the earlier texts are pointing out. Because when you stop and you consider Georgia itself, it is not one of the chief production places for gold in the world. So already you've got a problem with that interpretation. And as you go further in, he goes in and he actually shows how it is that they actually, to this day, they still mine this gold in this very same way from these rivers. They take a square, set of boards that's basically a bunch of cross boards over the top of each other that drain through over the top of a piece of wool, or better known as fleece, and that's the way that they collect the gold dust. Now, how is it that gold dust all of a sudden becomes important? There is a city that is very well known throughout ancient times when you start going into this region, especially at the time of the Persian Empire, during the time of the Achaemenid Empire, and it's listed within all of their texts that have been unearthed, that they were actually brought forth the most gold. But it says something very peculiar on top of it. It states that the satrapy of Gandhara, that they paid in gold dust. And the amount of gold dust that they actually paid was higher than anybody else in the entirety of the kingdoms. That money that they brought forward, that gold dust that they brought forward, was one of the main financial factors. And it tells you implicitly in these texts that this was located in Gandhara. And you're going to want to take note of Gandhara, everybody. Your mind is already going to associate it with some other places for some of you that have studied other religions in the world and so forth, but this place has a much deeper history than I think people even fathom. And at some point in time, we're going to have to address these later religions that actually took place here, because there's a crucial key that's been hidden. And you're going to have to understand why this becomes so important in light of all the rest of the work concerning the kings of the East, the wise men that came from the East. There was something that happened, and it's major. And with not seeing it, it just leaves everything in confusion. This is why it was crucial in understanding, as I brought up earlier. We have this misconception that's floated around. I don't know when this started, but we've got so many people that are stating that the Zoroastrian religion is one of the oldest religions in the world. Well, if that's the case, folks, let me ask a very crucial question. Why did Cyrus the Great not once mention Ahura Mazda? You will find it nowhere mentioned through Cyrus the Great. But all of a sudden it starts popping up all over the place when we come to the time of Darius the Great. Historically speaking, via the work of a multitude of scholars now that have spent a great deal of time, there's even an explorer that went into that region as well, and his book is actually quite illuminating as far as how much he was able to understand and reveal just from traveling through there of what happened as concerning Zarathustra. And they will all tell you now emphatically that you were looking at him being alive at the very exact same time that Darius the Great was alive. So now that we've locked in Zarathustra being alive during that stage, this starts to sort of unlock a much deeper key into understanding these wise men from the East. So we're going to move forward, but keep that locked in your mind, why Gandhara is important. Now, let me explain this as well. What else is Afghanistan always been known for? Since ancient times, it was the chief mine. It was the only place that this was being brought forward. In ancient times, this is charted through all sorts of trade texts that have been found all over the world, stuff that is dating back through things that happened with the Canaanites. You have texts that bring this up with the Amorites. You can trace this over and over and over again. You have it in Tutankhamun's mask, as a matter of fact, in Egypt. And this is one very specific item that was only from here in ancient times. And this is lapis lazuli. God left us a very crucial detail right there in broad daylight. And you'll find out that that word in the Hebrew comes from a different word that's got the sapphire connotation within what it says. And it's been translated a multitude of times as lapis lazuli. Now, one of the earliest texts that I have seen is this actually had come up at the time of Samaria with Enmerkar. And for those that are unfamiliar with Enmerkar, David Rohl did some excellent work on, very, very good points that Enmerkar very well might have been the infamous Nimrod that built the Tower of Babel. Now, I got to sit down and watch a documentary that he did on this quite some time back for a program that I believe was called Mysteries of the Bible. And there was a lot of things that I really enjoyed in that documentary, especially the way they spent a great deal of time actually showing David's life and explaining how it is that he goes about the work that he does. And it was just that biography alone was very fascinating. But when you look at the information that he brought forward concerning Enmerkar, it's really, really good. So it's a strong possibility. But this is one of the first texts that I had stumbled on to just in precursory glances of Enmerkar sending out the Amorite going after the lapis lazuli. So, the context of the text I need to look back over again to sort of verify a strange claim that I found going on with some ancient megalithic sites that have been found in the Ukraine. And so this is one of our earliest references to lapis lazuli. So we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that Enmerkar was actually sending these people over into these caves. And, well, it is a cave, yes, but what these mines are is it's an ancient lapis lazuli mine that is in Afghanistan, and they've dug into these mountains, and you can see this detailed in this documentary. They're still using those same mines into this mountain, into this day and age. And this is some of the toughest work for these people that do this to this day, because they will follow these veins of this lapis lazuli, and sometimes they will lose the vein, and they can be in there for months before they're even able to find it again. And the health risks involved, they don't really live too much longer after going in there, just because of all the different dusts and all that, obviously, that are inside of a mountain. But now we know why it is that the Lord amplified lapis lazuli. It was very crucial for us to see. And I felt sort of like a dunce when I was looking back over all this material and had realized that I did not see one of the most crucial hints that was going to help us unlock this. So now we know on top of it, Afghanistan was known for its lapis lazuli. The other gemstones that are mentioned there, I went through, and I have a link to this in the PDF that I'm referencing as we speak, that also goes in and lists all of the stones that are found in Afghanistan. And guess what? They're all sitting there. Okay, so now we're really sitting on top of an actual location here with Havilah that's got verifiable, backable evidence now. We have this ancient story from the most ancient versions of this with Jason and the Argonauts that Alexander the Great was obsessed with. How is it and why is it that he was trying to get here? What was the method of all of this? And that goes back to this Phasis River. Now you look at some of the other Greek variants of the text, you're going to find out that one of the key places to locking it in is a place called Tanis, which is in Russia. And Tanis also happens to be the name of a river deity that was associated with the Scythian. All right, folks, as we had the nice flyover view there of, this is ancient Tanis. This is this Russian city that's been located with this, and this is crucial to understanding what was going on and going through Alexander the Great's mind. Now, right here as we zoom out, we're going to get to see something. I want everybody to take note of, we have the Black Sea right here. This is stretching up into the Sea of Azov, and as you can see as we stroll down in, you still have a clear-cut channel that goes through here. Now, as we pull this out further, and we go up here, we zoom back in on top of Tanis. Everybody take note of these river channels. Now, these river channels in ancient times were actually far broader than this due to the flooding that happened all throughout this region. And this was how you ended up connecting over into, for the next river, most notably, this is the waterway which the ancients were using back even into megalithic times. Let me repeat myself. Back in megalithic times, during what the archaeologists would consider the Stone Age, they were building large boats. And you can see this with the oldest archaeological finds in Greece, which was a megalithic, or which was a Neolithic site, which was back in the Stone Age, and they had these large boats all over. You can see these boats all over the place in pictographs that have been found in the Ukraine as well. And as a matter of fact, I kind of stumbled. As you're going to see later, we do have one in Afghanistan and Pakistan and this whole region. But as you can see right here, this is the watercourse. Now, Alexander the Great had sent one of his generals right up here to the Black Sea to try to figure out how it was that this ancient text with referring to the Argonauts, how it was that he was connecting and getting through this waterway to travel over here into the Caspian Sea and then later into the Oxus River itself. So there was a bit of a method to Alexander's madness here, because he knew full well if he was able to unlock this ancient trade route, this ancient waterway, he was going to be able to come in and go through and connect with the very kings of the East themselves. So this starts to unlock all sorts of things when you understand how it was that the geography through this region was actually quite different. Without being able to see that, none of this is going to make sense, folks, and you have got to get this through your minds. And even some of you, I would highly advise going out there and looking into books concerning this. There's some actually newer ones even on top of it that discuss the fact that ancient geographies are not even remotely close to what we consider modern geography. The modern geographies are going to confuse you. So once again, now that you've got an overhead view of what we're dealing with there, let us move back over now that I've explained the importance of the Tanis and this connecting route that Alexander the Great was following. Because Alexander the Great, on top of it, what was he looking for, everybody? What was the key element of why he was trying to get there as well? Well, in part, it had everything to do with that golden fleece. And that golden fleece, from what I've found, there's actually two meanings to it. And the second meaning we're not going to touch on today, because that one is really quite mind-blowing in and of itself. That will give you a better understanding here of what was going through Alexander's mind. Now we're going to go back over here and start moving forward, because we've locked in two places now, everybody. Now that we've established where it is that Havilah was situated, and we've locked in the source for that river, Now we can move into what I just spoke of a moment ago. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It flows through the whole land of Kush. Now, this is just one reference in about, I would have to say, a billion that you can actually find out there once again within these texts from the 1800s. They all continually are saying the same thing. And this is why when I stumbled on this in the first place, and I'm going to stop here actually. Let me pop it back over here and explain this real fast. Now, I want to point out something, everybody, folks. There's a reason I began to start looking at the Oxus River itself. I was looking through some varied photographs of different archaeological findings that have been found throughout this region, and I stumbled onto something very peculiar that was called the Oxus treasure. Now, when I sat down and I began to look over this Oxus treasure, I realized something in a matter of seconds. When you look at this treasure, it is filled with gold statues of men that are standing there wearing the atypical dress of the Saka Tiger Huda, or the Scythian with pointy hats, as Herodotus refers to them. And at that point in time when these were found, they continued to label these, they just called them Aryan Persian treasures, etc. And I don't know that anybody has gone back since that time and even looked at them again. But you can still freely find these photos all over the place, even in the museum where they are being shown to this day on top of it. And you'll see exactly what I said. There's dudes standing around. They're wearing the atypical Saka Tiger Huda armor that they would wear in ancient times. So that was one of the first things that actually made me go, okay, what's going on here with the Oxus treasure? It was when I began to look into this Oxus treasure, the only hits I was actually pulling up was this documentary about Alexander's Lost World. So this actually ended up pulling things back around 2 times to Alexander the Great again. But the Oxus River, I knew at that stage there had to be something more to it. I did not realize it was going to actually entail what it was that I found afterwards. So let us move back over here into this PDF. Just going to give a couple of little quick notes here in this piece that I pulled out of a text from 1829. Bactriana joins Arya on the northern side and formed one of the richest satrapies. It corresponds to the modern Bala and belongs to the kingdom of the Afghans and Kalabistan. The river Oxus, Gihon, separated the province of Bactriana from Sogdia. Its proximity to northern India and the possession of a large river with fertile lands made it in very remote ages the center of Asiatic commerce and the point of union for all the natives of the vast continent. The capital was Bactra, on a branch of the Oxus, Zariaspa, which is sometimes supposed to be a different name for the same city and was probably another town. The modern Balagh carries on a considerable trade with India, Persia, and other countries. The satraps of its rich province were often tempted to declare themselves independent under the Greeks. It became a powerful state with very extended but unknown limits. The investigation of the Greek Empire of Bactriana is a curious subject which allows much room for conjecture. Yes, folks. And he brings up a very good point there. I'm not going to go into much more detail of this. Now, the ancient city of Bactria has been something that has been a bafflement for scholars. They are still trying to get to the bottom of where this actual location is. And if you go in and you look at the documentary I mentioned, he's going to make this full well apparent that to this day, they don't really know for certain where it is. Now, he does have some interesting theories concerning this, and he points out in the text, and yes, I've come across these same things myself several times, that the Greek text state it was by a certain mountain. It had a sister city, which was that Zariaspa that was mentioned previously. And he does come to one location where he's got strong suspicions that the one is Zariaspa and the one next to it is Bactria. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, and the unfortunate problem is, as I stated before, with all that's going on in Afghanistan, the fact alone that those digs may never happen could be a strong probability. But I think that in his documentary, he made a very strong argument that I know myself, looking at what he was pointing out, it is very hard to discount. Now, he was fairly well convinced that this city, the Zariaspa, was the one that was referenced in the ancient text. From everything that he showed when he was walking around in this place, once again, some very strong conclusions. Now, if he's absolutely right, it's not for me to say, but nonetheless, I think his approach and his theoretical premise for this did definitely have some strong and valid points. So now that we've touched on that, we can move a little bit forward here, because there's technically a lot more things I could cover here, but it's just time again, folks, and that's why we can't cover everything here. It's just not going to be possible. So let me move back forward into this again. Now, we've just touched on that here. Now, this is where I'm going to go in, and I'm just going to show a little bit of this. You can actually find this website that a person drew up. It's called Forgotten Realms of the Oxus Region. Just type that in. You'll pull it up in 2 seconds. And he goes in and, gives some of his own commentary on everything that was done in his video. You can see here, this is Karzima or Korziama. And let's see here. We've got a few other little odds and ends here. But he's got this map here that is really quite interesting, because this is all the different spots that actually go through and trace the different places within the Oxus River and where they've moved, etc. Because you have to understand that the channels of this river have moved many times. There is a reason that this has been called the Crazy River in ancient times, folks. The Gihon, literally in the ancient tongues, that's what it meant. And due to the fact that it was changing courses on a continual basis, entire civilizations lived and died because of the course of this river moving all throughout history. And as he goes through and he shows in this documentary, you can quite clearly see the channels that this river carved. You can see all these ancient civilizations, and you can even see the evidence of the fact that that's exactly what happened, that these civilizations were thriving. They were just unbelievable civilizations. And there's even a multitude of these that date back to the early Bronze Age, which makes them the fact that they were alone during the other major empires that they have now realized that were in the world outside of Sumeria. We've had the Harappa civilization that's been found. We've had the civilizations now that are turning up over here all throughout Central Asia on top of it, that once again, just like all the ancient archaeological finds, you begin to understand how deeply connected the ancient world truthfully was, and how extensive the merchants and all trade was. It's going to be important to point this out. There was a lot of things I stated last week, and after looking at the documentary for a third time, it actually states in there that they have found out that these people are one of the primary root races, basically, as far as genetics are concerned. So what he was telling you is that essentially that the people of Kush directly descended through this line of people called the Wakan, who are now calling themselves descendants of Alexander, which that in and of itself is actually quite fascinating. I think this is relevant and important that I stop and I point out on top of it a theory that we need to quash right now so that people stop getting confused about this. During the 1800s, during the time that the British had came in and occupied India, this new theoretical approach about the history of India came forward that they dubbed the Aryan invasion theory. Now, this was dubbed by a man that his last name was Miller. And he spent a vast amount of time going through all their ancient Rigvedic texts, through the Sanskrit and so forth. And prior to him dying, he stated flat out that there is no way that this idea that I came up with, this Aryan invasion theory, could indeed be true, because this language is so very ancient that it is absolutely unbelievable. Now, everybody that still pushes this Aryan invasion theory to this very day, for some reason, does not realize that he made that statement himself. Also, the people of ancient India never referred to themselves as being Aryan. That word in their language actually means noble. They will emphatically tell you that the word for the people, for our people living here in India, has always been Bharat. So it's real important to really quickly point that out, everybody, so you can kind of get that concept out of your mind, because every time throughout history, as we've stated before, we see that name Aryan pop up, and all of a sudden these very, very wicked things start happening around, centered around this name. Now, if you took note of what Matthew said before concerning Darius the Great, all of a sudden all of this makes absolute and complete sense. I'm going to pull the PDF back in here. I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think I might have made a mistake and not covered some of this stuff in the PDF because my camera was still on. Let me backtrack here, folks, a little bit. All right, we're going to go in here, and this is one of these fortresses found in this area. Now, again, take note. Right here, if you look at the trail of this Oxus River, best known as a Gihon, you can see the different water courses. You can see the different variant places that it's been traced through. And you can find this in Forgotten Realms of the Oxus region Google Maps engine. Once again, more of the different fortresses that have been found there, the Panj River. This is in Afghanistan again. Move through here and touch on little tidbits here and there. Once again, this is one of the other fortresses. I believe this might have been one of the ones that they actually dated to being an Islamic fortress. I'm not certain, no. Move forward again here. Now take a look at that, folks. This was a Bronze Age complex of Gandhara Tepe. Now, I just mentioned the fact that they have found Bronze Age civilizations there that they have now dated to being in existence at the same time as Sumeria, the Harappan Indus Valley civilization, which is still a vast mystery just with the inscriptions and everything else that has been found there. I'm going to point this out fast too for people that aren't aware of this. They have found many different findings in this Harappan Indus civilization and in Sumeria as well that were from, in Sumeria they found ones that were from the Indus civilization, and in this Harappa civilization in Indus, they have found Sumerian findings over there as well. So this right here on top of it is the absolute proof that we know that at such an early stage, we had trade going on between these major empires. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is just what the Bible tells us, that this was happening on a worldwide scale. So now we begin to sort of dispel that Sumeria was the quote-unquote only major city and everything came through there, when all of a sudden we're finding worldwide that, wait a minute, we keep finding cities that were in existence at the same time. So now we begin to realize that this becomes a far more complex matter, and those trade routes have always been one of the most crucial aspects in unlocking history. If you, for folks out there that even want to look deeper into this, there's been a plethora of different texts that have been brought forward from findings. I know Eric Cline just did a book on the collapse of the Bronze Age, which I've read, and it's excellent with the amount of detail he goes into unlocking all these varied texts that have been found throughout the ancient world. We have texts that were written in Mari, Syria, from the Amorites that detail an extensive amount of the trade that were going on, and this just continues to build and build and build. It was really a small world in ancient times. Yes, we may have different technology, but they had a different way of staying connected. So we move forward here. Sogdiana, we've spoken about Sogdia many times. Bactria, once again. Another one of these, Khmer Tepe. This is overlooking the Bactrian Oxus. Ruins of Bactria, once again, modern day Balkh. Got Upper Bactria, the ruins of Tamki Sangan. And as he brought up, folks, I brought that up earlier, the famous Oxus treasure. It was discovered here in Takhti Sargon in the British colonial area. So this has been known about for quite some time. Now, everybody see what's right here? There's that lapis lazuli. This is being sold in Peshawar, Pakistan. All brought directly from the Sari Sang mines. Sari Sang mines. Well, where is that? It's in Afghanistan, folks. And this goes on to speak about the Wakan, the same people that I brought up that call themselves the children of Alexander. Now we start going into some of these areas, the Wakan village. This is another spot that's up there in these different routes that were coming between China, going down in through the Khyber Pass of Pakistan, and going in through Afghanistan, etc. And they've got these mysterious dome structures that they think were actually used as houses for the traveling people that were coming out of China while going through the trade routes. Some of the different missionary work with the Buddhist monks and so forth were using these places possibly as homes to stay in for the night to escape the cold weather. So they don't really know. And let's see here. And then he goes into his conclusion.
Ladies and gentlemen, information off the charts that Brian just brought out. We have always known, and they've always talked about, of course, the Silk Road. Brian and I have talked about this many times in direct correlation with the Book of Esther and, of course, Haman, the infamous Agagite. Once again, we see the importance here with that last part that Brian just brought up. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that motels are a little bit older than we think they are. With this in mind, it's perfectly obvious that what Brian and I have referenced many times, when you look at that strange name for Agagite and how this strange Haman, why on earth was this foreigner allowed to exercise dominion over the storehouses of the treasury? Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Once again, the Bible making references to someone or somebody that obviously, on a worldwide scale, as Brian just pointed out about these housing units, ladies and gentlemen, the most important thing to them was the trade routes. Why do these people call themselves the children of Alexander? Why, when you backtrack, you find that Alexander renamed this and planned on this being the capital of that region? Why did he rename it after himself? Alexandria, Aryan. It is this place which the Bible in the Hebrew calls Havilah. Ladies and gentlemen, it makes everything such of a massive importance when you realize the importance of these trade routes. It went right through here. Ladies and gentlemen, if the Pharaoh was using lapis lazuli, he was getting it from those Afghanistan mines that are right there, right in the midst of these rivers. Ladies and gentlemen, about course changes with rivers, don't we remember how Babylon was taken? Don't we all remember that you can go get all kinds of pictorial evidence that the Euphrates no longer goes through Babylon. It changed its course by a wide margin, This is the prime reason Babylon was left to dust after Alexander the Great died there. It amazes me how so many people don't know their own history concerning Alexander the Great. He died in Babylon because that's where he was planning on making his capital, was Babylon. That's a fact. He died in Babylon. I'm not lying to you. You need to look that up. With all these things in mind, it makes you wonder why it is that Alexander took that wife. A long, leisurely honeymoon with her. It makes you wonder why, come to find out, she was named after, of course, the local river. It makes you wonder just exactly why Alexander went on his great march. It makes you wonder where he got his marching orders from. Wrapping all this, maybe for the last time, around the ride, let us consider that all of the biblical clues may have been pointing us to this place the entire time. Now, repeatedly, Brian has brought up and showed to you the evidence that the scholars way back in the early 1800s, 1829, I pulled up a couple of references, and I think they were 1823. They all already knew exactly. They knew exactly about the Oxus River, that it was also called the Gihon. Yada, yada, yada. They already knew this upwards of over 150 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. They knew this before the Civil War, for Pete's sakes. Now, you have to realize that these things couldn't be known in that dark time. Because, of course, back then, these gentlemen writing in the 1800s, the early part of it, their work would have only progressed through the academia. It never would have been sold on bookstores. Ladies and gentlemen, there was not bookstores back in 1823. It would take someone that was faithful to look and look and look and look until they found it. It just really makes me want to take a look at the etymology for that agagite once again. There's something there because it tickles me that Brian shows me this verse, ask me about Havilah. Look at it in the Septuagint, it says something crazy. Yeah, there's it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't have any Strong's number, of course, but of course most of the Septuagint words are not marked or coded to Strong's. But I looked at it and I knew it was nothing. That says, well, in our tongue, that's EV, Evolat. Well, there's only one thing that could be a transliteration of, and it's not Havilah. Well, our translations call that Elat or Elat. That means garden. It means grove of trees. And I just, oh, the Lord has such wonderful things to show you if you would just look and listen. And it really does make me want to go back to that old Agagite and see why he was in charge. Taking note that he would have had to have a very particular set of skill set, because Pharaoh being on one end of that route, he would have sent the message up the chain that he wanted to make a royal epitaph, let us say for his wife or his mother. Of course, maybe both. And he wanted to inlet the eyes with lapis lazuli. He would have had to send that message the other direction, all the way up to the end of the trade route. So you realize that if there was housing going on, and everybody knows this, you can look this and all up. you know, up in all of the Bible maps that they have in the back of your Bible clearly says that the promised land was really the ancient highway. So that message would have went right through the promised land. And notice I didn't use the bad word, the cuss word, the P word. I didn't mention the PLO. They're God haters. I said the promised land. Anyway, that would have had to went right up the chain, right? It would have went right by, of course, Haman. He would have had to send that message to the next post, the next city on the trade route, and then to the next city. And that message would have had to go to just one place, those Lapis lazuli mines in Afghanistan. They couldn't have got it from anywhere else, hereby proving exactly what garden God was talking about in Ezekiel. Because all those stones and all that stuff can only be referring to one place. And that's what Alexander was looking for. And he knew this was tied part and parcel with a golden fleece. Ladies and gentlemen, go to this place and watch them because they don't change. For literally millennia, they collect their gold dust by filtering it through fleeces. Of course, then they would just take it and roll it up, and you realize what would protect the gold. What naturally is so vitally important and precious on wool. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the only thing that nursing mothers will medicate themselves with due to a lot of lactation? It's called lanolin. You buy it in tubes. You can only get that from wool. You can only get that from a fleece. So when you put those two and two together, realizes that, man, these guys knew what they were doing. They were using fleeces for a reason, because once they rolled it up, the lanolin, of course, would make it perfectly protected. Absolutely amazing when I think about it. They knew exactly how to do it. There's no way to change. Ladies and gentlemen, why change the plan when the plan's already perfect? Who knows how long it took them to figure out that, hey, man, we have all of these, Awasi. Remember I told you about those sheep? The Awasi breed? That's in the Bible source code. And all these sheep, they were eating, herding. Of course, these sheep, of course, would go up and down. Why? Because ask anybody, oh my goodness. Ask anybody in the Middle East. They'll tell you, hey, man, I got sheep for sale. Really? Is it a Awasi sheep? Because the Awasi sheep has the fattened tail, just like the Bible says. Remember that part in the sacrifices that I've told you about before? It said the sheep had the fat tail. That's obviously the Awasi sheep. Of course, they would ask you, well, is it Awasi or what is it? Or is it a bunk kind? But anyway, after they figured out what was the best way, they didn't change it. It stayed that way. They would do everything they could to perfect the process, and that's the way it would stay for time immortal. Of course, we just figured that out with another magnificent key when we did the Scourge of God. Ladies and gentlemen, right there in the ancient histories, he give you a cuisine. Brian says, well, that should be pretty easy. Right there it says what they were eating. Where on earth do they eat that particular type of cuisine? Right there it was, sitting in broad daylight. Sitting in broad daylight. There's only one place on the planet they eat that particular cuisine. That is right there in that ancient historical text. They haven't changed. There's no reason for them to change. That's what works. They weren't randomly using fleeces to collect their gold dust. They were doing it because of the lanolin. So it's just absolutely amazing how you sit back and look and you take a deep breath. And the only reason why all of this has been brought forth today is because we believe the Bible's true. Now, to a large extent, we do not understand it. That, however, is irrelevant. We believe it. I mean, it really is amazing to me how the best way to put it, the best way to explain it is you must become like a child. I mean, my children, when they were little, asked me about the course of the moon and the sun. And I did explain it to them, even though at the time they couldn't understand what I was talking about. They couldn't see what it was they were standing on. They could never move their point on the globe, of course, or of course, as God says it, the gyro, that's what he says, it's a sphere. He actually don't call it a sphere, he calls it a gyro. But anyway, they were not old enough to be able to move their vantage point to outside into the heavens to realize what I was talking about. The moon was going around us and we were going about the sun. It's the same way with the Bible. Much of what it says, even the Brian and I can't comprehend it. We're amazed by it, like today. Brian was amazed. Don't you realize? Brian asked me the question because he believed it, he just didn't know what it was. Hey, Matthew, the Hebrew says, Havilah. That's what this translation says. But the Septuagint, it says Elat. Well, why would it say that? I just looked at it and whoa. Because he's purposely doing that to you on purpose. So you'll know he's talking about the garden, the grove of trees. You just had to. Like I said, even though Brian didn't understand it, he believed it. So he asked me about it, and he told me to look into that while he puts together this massive PDF, because he already sent me one, but it, of course, you know how God is with me and Brian. As we're doing preparation for the show, more times than once, Brian just had to scrap that PDF and start again. He had so much to add, as is the case right now. So when we take a deep breath and look at it, who knows what is all there more we could find? Who knows? It's too wonderful for my eyes, I guess. But this much I do know. The Lord has but one axe. He is the Assyrian. And he worships God of war. But when the Lord is done using him, he uses something else to take his land out, his people out, or annihilated. Those forces that side with the Syrian will be wiped out by the kings from the east. No doubt about it. They've did it before, they'll do it again. That's what God said, and that's what God meant. He meant that when it happened the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and around the right we go. Because God chases after what has been. That which has been is that which will be. You see, your so-called eschatology experts are lying to you, one way or the other. Most of them will tell you that eschatology is either future tense or past tense. They'll either be preterist or rapturist. They're both lying. Not by volition, most of them. It's not their intention to do that. They just don't believe what God said. God said that eschatology is isochronal. With his own mouth, he told you multiple times that time is cyclical. Eschatology, therefore, must be isochronal. And no one says that. You have two sides of this coin. You're only allowed to see two candidates. Those two candidates are, that's right, future tense and past tense. No, it's not. It's isochronal. It's cyclical. Everybody knows what bands are. They're not linear. You can't tie anything up with anything that's linear. It has to be a band.
As we've went through this, I've actually been covering both rivers. We started with Havilah, moved into there, and then I moved into the Gihon, the Oxus. These are the two easternmost rivers. These are the main areas I fixated and focused on in this work because at this point in time, I don't see any reason to question neither the Tigris nor the Euphrates. Maybe at some different point I might look deeper at that again, but for now, that's only the relevant portion of what we need to look at is these two unidentified rivers. And concerning the Pison and Havilah, those two have remained a massive mystery. And once we get into another text here in a moment, as I illustrate this, you're going to see that a logical conclusion was made. I would definitely agree with some of the ideas that they had for the Havilah, but it just did not make sense to me. The more and more and more I spent time triangulating with these original sources of these rivers. And I'm going to point that out quick, everybody. This is where it gets crucial. This is why I'm going to have to go back and look at the Tigris and the Euphrates much deeper, because there's been exploration that has been done concerning the Oxus River, or as I'm referring to it, the biblical text as in the Gihon. It's Arya Daru, I believe, now is what the term for this river is. And there's been many explorations that were done back in between the 1800s and the 1900s. And one of the first explorers came to one conclusion. He was actually inadvertently right. The issue was, and it's as I stated concerning the Oxus River itself, there was an earthquake that cut that off in the 1900s. So the secondary conclusion that was made by the next explorer, well, he was also correct as well. It's just he walked into a different stage in history, and he was looking at a different source. So I'm going to point out here, first I'm going to point out the original source so everybody can see it. That's what I'm actually zoomed in on right here. Now I want to zoom this out just a little bit because there's something really interesting. When you take a look at this basin that remains here, and folks, you got to understand something on top of it here too. The blessing that we actually have in our hands to have satellite data from the entire world at our fingertips and be able to zoom out and look at these things in the light of trying to track down these locations in which the Bible is referring to is literally unbelievable. As I stated, there's explorers that had to go out and do these things manually. The amount of resources and hard work that was involved just within the expeditions alone of going up into these two areas, as you can see by that documentary by David Adams. As he goes up in there, he has to first stop with the Wakan people, and then he has to pick up, he gets halfway, and the Wakan are like, well, you're to phase 2. Now you're going to come in, and you're going to go here with the Kyrgyz, and they're going to take you the rest of the way. The journey is just literally unbelievable. They had to walk up and through all these different mountain passes. And it's one heck of a journey, but it's a beautiful journey. I would so love to be able to go to these places, this whole land, everywhere that's entailed where Alexander went is just incredible. You know, our understanding in this modern day and age of Pakistan, Afghanistan, you know, just through the media alone, we've come into this mindset. You know, we automatically equate this with the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda and varied Islamic forces, and we don't realize the reality of how these people live, what a mass majority of this population is like there, the land itself, how beautiful it is, the meals they sit down to eat, just everything across the board. And it literally makes me just have to state, like I told Matthew earlier in the week, folks, we've forgotten how to live. When you see these ancient cultures like this that are still living the same way they did since ancient times, you know, gathering together, they eat in a great big wide open area outside. Everybody gathers together to eat their meals. And then you look at what's on the table you have to marvel at it, because us people here in the West in America, we deal with the saturated processed food that we have to throw in the microwave. You just This whole region, it to me is just absolutely fascinating. Everywhere you go, that would be referred to as these eastern portions of the world. We've got these very specific spots, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China. God has set these places aside. They're literally, to this day, they still have remnants. Look at India, look at China. Those nations have been around since time immemorial. We've got these regions throughout the steppes where you still have a multitude of the nomadic people that to this day live exactly the same way they did in ancient times. And it's amazing. It is just incredible to just look at these cultures and just see these people. Our modern day understanding through our news channels and all that really sort of obscures the way that we view the world as it was in ancient times. And it's just something we have to break that pattern, folks. We have to break out of that. But now that I've went into that, now as you can see, this when you actually see the course that is drawn, especially that he goes through and draws in this documentary, he points out that this original source, it does a loop within a circle. And it's actually quite amazing what this river used to do, the Oxus, or as I refer to it, the Gihon River. Now, this is Wakhan Corridor. After this earthquake in the 1900s cut this spot off, the source of the river actually came up here into a cave. And I actually took the from one of the explorers that recently had went there on an expedition. He very nicely put in the exact geographic coordinates, and this is where the Oxus River now is coming from. There's a cave right here that's a glacier melt, and you can, when they were up there, you can see all the water running off from this source, and it's quite something to behold as well. Just quite beautiful. So we've got that locked in. Now I'm going to show everybody, we're going to go first over into this main region over in Afghanistan where the lapis lazuli has been known to come from since ancient times. This is this Badakhshan region. That's where it came from. Now here is the actual lapis lazuli mine itself, which is known as Sari Sang. So as we dive down on top of this, this is where they're going in, and Google Earth is being funny. It doesn't like going in that far. But you can see this is the mountain that they are actually going up into. You can see even some of the pathways and so forth, but once again, that's where kind of seeing this stuff with your own eyes, watching the work of explorers and so forth that went there, you really begin to fathom, the depths of how ancient this mountain is that they've carved these tunnels into. And it's the exact same mine that they used in ancient times that was referred to when Emrakar was sending out these emissaries that were the Amorite that were going to these lapis lazuli mines. And they bring up they were either merchants or they were emissaries. They're not quite certain. This is the same place that they were going to. So when you see a mine inside of a mountain, it's still the same cut-in tunnels that they continue to expand since back to the dawn of recorded history. That is just something else to really, really see. So I believe we touched on those two spots. So this is where we need to get back in here and now bring up the next point. This one was the one that I think most of all really left me shocked, because I came across this, and when I found out about it, I immediately sent a message to Matthew and just stated, "You've got to be joking. There's no way that this is possible. This has got to be a lie. This has got to be a joke. This can't even, no." Well, I checked into it, folks, and it's indeed, and it's been here since ancient times. Its root words, as you will see in a moment, it traces to the earliest forms of Sanskrit in the earliest portions of the Rig Veda. All right, and moving into this next point, this PDF here. Now let's move forward with this. This book was written in 1871. This used to be used as a textbook within the academic realms. All right, this is from one spot in that book. These localities having been the cradle of post-Diluvian humanity, nations who had preserved their remembrance were naturally led to the place, there also the cradle of antediluvian man. Among the Indians, men before the deluge, like those after it, descended from Mount Meru. There is found the Hariva Cuneiform, the true terrestrial paradise. These also we are led by the Greek paradisical myth of the Meropes, the people of Meru. The Persians described the Aryanam Vajito, situated in Mount Barazat, as a paradise exactly resembling that of the book of Genesis until the day when the fall of our first parents and the wickedness of Ahriman, the spirit of evil, transformed into an abode of insupportable cold. The name also of Eden has been applied at one time to this region, but is clearly found in the name of the kingdom of Odiana, or the garden near Kashmir, watered by 4 rivers, precisely as was the Mosaic Eden. It is certain that 2 of the rivers of paradise in the Bible narrative are 2 of the largest rivers, which take their rise in the mountain mass of Belatru and the Pamir, the one to the north, the other to the south. Gihon is the Oxus, still called Gihon by the people on its banks. In Pison, we recognize, and everyone, I'm going to stop here quick, folks. This was the old thought on this. I understand why it is they said this. Nonetheless, this is where many of these people were locating it into the Indus with the land of Havilah, which is rich in gold and precious stones, etc. This kind of is, once again, going back into a biblical ancient times geography lesson of where the ancient nation of India actually encompassed. Again, these names have changed. So I can understand their conclusion where they went with this. Yet, let's point something out here that I noticed on top of it while we were preparing for this in this last week. We already were told that the Gihon, the Oxus River, surrounded the land of Cush. So guess what? The Havilah, yes, it's still in this region, but nonetheless, we were told that one of those rivers encompassed. Well, that's already what the Oxus, the Gihon River, has done. So moving forward from there. But we must we conclude with some scholars the absolute identity of the biblical Eden with Araru Kuru, or the Aryanam Vajo. Need we suppose with these critics that the occurrence of the names of the Tigris and Euphrates as the rivers of paradise are the result of subsequent confusion? We think not. It seems to us, as to M. Bunsen, that in the mind of Moses, Eden had far greater extent than the paradise of the Indians and Iranians. And that echoes something that I was discussing with Matthew going back into last week, which struck me as odd when I looked at this again. Nonetheless, if we take literally the indications of the Bible as to the 4 rivers which went out of Eden, they clearly mark out a vast region stretching from the mountains where to the east rise of the Oxus and the Indus to these mountains, whence on the west flow the Tigris and Euphrates, a fertile and temperate land, a really delicious abode situated between regions burned up by heat or wasted by cold. It is there that the inspired Hebrew legislator most probably thought that our species first saw the light. We can cut past a little bit of that. Irregardless, what the Bible tells us specifically is that there was Eden, and then there was the garden, which was planted eastward in Eden. And a river came through watering that, and it went out and did what? It went out and became 4 heads. Hence why I've brought up the importance of having the actual sources of these rivers. Because we have to lock in the sources to understand where that river is. That if that river was still there to this day, it would have been a very easy solution from the beginning. So this is why I had to do triangulation, and without being able to lock in this missing region of Havilah and this missing Pishon, the whole rest of it was not going to make sense. Now, everybody, take note of the fact that he brought up in here, he referred to a place called Al-Diana. Now, this is where I'm going to dive in and bring this in real fast. The Sanskrit dictionary, and if you look over this, you're going to find out that several of these words are actually from the early portions of the Rig Veda. There are ones that are in the varied Puranas, which are texts that were written much later, and this begins to get very complicated when you start dealing with all the ancient texts of India. But when you've got stuff that's showing up in the Rig Veda itself, you know right then and there that you're dealing with something far more ancient than these more modern texts throughout time. Not necessarily modern, but they were written much later is the better word to say it. Now we have here the Udanya, which means watery. We have this on top of it here again, the Udanya, which means born or living in water. The Adanya. Once again, these are, I believe, Rishi is referring to a person. I'm not certain here, folks. We have the Pa Udanya, which was the name of a city. Once again, we have the Vadanya, which is the name of a city. So now you have two places, and if I remember correctly, both of those were references to the Mahabharata itself. And for those that are interested, I would advise taking a look into the Mahabharata because the contention involved about when that was written is just quite some argument. But there's certain points in there that have definitely really began to make people reconsider things due to the fact that we have dried up rivers and all sorts of interesting things mentioned there. And even those locations of those rivers are under contention. That was actually two places I looked. Knowing about this dried up river, it began to make me wonder if there was maybe something to look for there. So that was one possible thought that went through my head. But we have, once again, we have a further description here. We have got thirsty, waterly, thirsty. As you can see, this is pointing at the Rig Veda with that one. Born or living in water. Once again, Rig Veda on both of those. So let's see here. We've got this again to be thirsty to irrigate. And we've got, the very different usages of this word, etc. So let's move past that now. Now, where in the world could this place be that it's referring to? I'm going to stop and point out one real important fact here. This is on top of it. This confused a person I noticed not far back that located Eden somewhere else. This is back not too far. I believe it was around the 80s that he made this proclamation. But there is a word in the Sumerian cuneiforms, that refers to Eden and it spells it E-D-I-N. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that you find out through the work of the Assyrianologist that Matthew referred to earlier, the leech, that word means step. Step or plain. Now, folks, there's only a certain portion of the world that refers to a steppe. Okay, that's Central Asia. So right there in the Sumerian, we had something encoded to us. Now, we come into this place that the modern name of it now is Adina, A-D-I-N-A. And this is taken from the ancient forms of those Sanskrit words that I brought up previously. And of all places for this to be, this is in the Swabi district of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. This is in the Khyber Pass, everybody. Now, we did a set of programs that were in a podcast, actually, that were in audio format, where we detailed the Pashtun. And the Pashtun, they know for certain, even through genetic testing now, that we have got Manasseh and we have Ephraim in this area. And as the Bible tells us, we have a couple more taken there. Now, you're going to get a reference here that came up in the Wikipedia, which was a false lead. That's actually not what this word is. And luckily, I searched it out to find out that this was, once again, I'm going to point this out. The only reason I use Wikipedia is to get leads of somewhere else to look deeper. And for simplicity's sake, I will put those little things in here within the PDFs. But the plethora of material that I have, the mass majority of this is usually tied into books. Now, it turns out that the reason he used this word in here, where they got this idea that Khyber is the Hebrew word for fort, was because of the writings of an Islamic man that had, he did some great work on what he brought forward, but when he got to this spot, he goes, there's no river in this region, so that word has to mean fort, because there's a fort here. Well, I just showed you guys, or I will actually show you guys, never mind, I haven't got there yet, because we will. This place is exactly what the Bible refers to as Kanabar, which is, it's a river. Now, they locate it as Assyria, but let's look at the context here. We actually have variants of this word. I had to do a extended search, and I took all the uses of this word where sometimes the Hebrew word is actually longer, etc. And this is all of them. We have it here in Exodus 21, verse 25, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. 2 Kings 17, verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah Habor by the rivers of Gozan and in the city of the Medes. And the king of Assyria carried away Israel to Assyria and put them in Halah and Habor by the river of Gozan in the city of the Medes. And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them to Halah and Habor and Hera and to the river Gozan to this day. I'm going to stop here real fast. Now, why are they translating this as a river in Assyria? Well, folks, that location was under Assyrian control at that point in history. So the definition may be a touch misleading. And in reality, they would be right. But once again, that's where we have to understand what the Assyrian Empire looked like, what the seed of the Assyrian. Again, it's right here. Now we've got a list of everybody that was sent to this very location. Psalms 38, verse 5, my wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness. From the sole of the foot to the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and petrifying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. Pay attention to what it says here in Hosea 4, verse 17. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Everybody, you recall what I just said about the genetic testing that has been done, where they realized that the half-tribe of Ephraim was within this fierce group of warriors known as the Pashtun. These Pashtun, they're a force that nobody wants to tangle with in that part of the world. And they're some of the most vicious fighters that are living there. Acts 16, verse 33. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes and was baptized, he and all his straightway. Galatians 6, verse 17, from now on let no man trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Ephesians 4, verse 16, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplies according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, makes increase of the body to the edifying of itself in love. This is where I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to let Matthew come in here and give his take on the fact that we have this word being used in the Bible, which on top of it draws us to this Khyber Pass, where this Odayanya, or this Adina, is to this day. To me, this is rather curious and amazing at the same time.
Well, I don't know so much about curious part. It makes sense to me because all it said was that they were carried away to the Land of Syria, of course, Assyria was in control of this area at said time. And of course, we all know how the Assyrians did it. They always did. They would take half the people, relocate them to the districts of Assyria, and then take Assyrians, pure-blooded Assyrians, and replace the relocated indigenous population, hereby spreading his seed everywhere, literally. That's the way they've done it, so it makes perfect sense to me. It sounds like that's what the Bible meant the whole time. You were expected to know that. You were expected to know that we've covered enough to let you know that Alexander knew what this place was. Darius knew what this place was. By extrapolation, I'm sure that Cyrus the Great knew what this place was. This was the event horizon. That's what this was. And, we've talked about this enough so that everybody should realize that this was a textbook from the 1800s. You could only get it academically, of course, at probably only the institution that the author came from. Remember, that's how they used to do it back then. So with that in mind, you realize the limited scope of how many people were actually able to obtain the information contained here in these documents, these books. But it was always in the Bible. You just had to kind of believe it. And the references to where Brian just read, those prophetic impregnations to the text itself. Do you know, ladies and gentlemen, when you read the Bible in its source code, God does this to you in Greek and in Hebrew. I'm sitting there reading it and I'll see something stands out right in the middle of it. Much like I was talking about the riddle. I think I called that document the keys to the rapture riddle. Ladies and gentlemen, right there in Greek, when you know what you're reading, you can read it in Greek. Just make you shake your head because that can only mean one thing. You see, because, I don't need to go into that. The point is this. Brian has provided you with extensive documentation that this place that he has showed you is in fact not only where the located of Eden was. Brian went out of his way to tell you that the garden was not in Eden. The garden was east of Eden. And then when you pull up the globe and look at it, oh my goodness, it makes perfect sense what's being talked about here. This is the place. It's always been the place. And what's funny is that's why God put it into the heart of the Assyrian to relocate these particular tribes there. We're already talking about scientific evidence. We already know, me and Brian talked about it a very long time ago, it seems now. They've already did the genetic testing on these people. They're from the children of Abraham. So when you look at it in a prophetic light, a lot of those prophecies talking about those particular tribes, well, they might be referring to something that was right in front of our face all the time. Like I said, everybody knows about the Soviet war that Afghanistan had back in the 80s. Ah, yes, the final generation. Makes you think of that generation. I hope everybody realizes just exactly what year the first Zionist Congress met. What year is it? That'd make it about 120 years ago. But anyway, that's beside the point. Amazing the prophetic ramifications that we're looking at here. It makes my heart go pitter patter.
On to the next section. Continue to expand on this place, everybody. Udayana. I'm going to give just a little clippets here. Once again, this was written in 1898. This is the Asiatic Society, Calcutta, India. And as I stated before, folks, there was a lot of material coming out at this point in history. This was when Britain was in there as an occupying force, and on top of it, though, it brought a lot of scholars from that part of the world that began to look over all the texts there, and a mass majority of them, as they looked over these ancient Sanskrit texts, they really could not fathom what it was that they were looking at. So you'll find out that there's so many different academic articles that are out there from this point in history. And this is on this section of Udayana. Meager as the details are, they show yet clearly that in searching for the national and literary affinities of the race which held the rule of Kia, Pishi, and Gandhara in Hunsang's time, we have to look to the Turkish tribes in the north and not in the direction of India. A century later, Udayana too had passed under the same domination, whereas Hinsang speaks yet of independent kings in Udayana. We see from the passage of the Tang Annals that AD 745, this territory was already united with Gandhara and Kia Pishi under the same rule in that year. Popo, king of Kipin, is said to have received the imperial authority for assuming the title of King of Kipin in Ochang. A historical fact would allow us to account for the occurrence of the Turkish inscription in regions like Swat and Banur, which undoubtedly belonged to Udayana. Notwithstanding, the record with Hunsang has left us at the connection of the language and writing of Udayana with that of India. The publications of the Danish Academy and the Finno-Ugrian Society containing the Orkhon inscriptions are, to my regret, not accessible to me at present. I am therefore unable to ascertain with which several types of writing distinguished above their characters shows more affinity. This goes on to essentially state that this person did not have access to this at the time. Now, what they're pointing out here is at this later stage in history, and we've spoken about this already, folks, when you're dealing with the kings of the East as well. He brings up the Turkic groups, he brings up the Mongolians, and brings up the Finno-Ugrian. And I told everybody last week, those were the original blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scythian they were finding up there in the Siberian mountains. This has been documented in vast amounts of archaeological data throughout Russia, where they still are looking at it and are very puzzled by it. Because of the language itself on top of it, they can't wrap their minds around how it is that you have what they'll refer to as an Indo-European language base coming throughout the rest of these groups, but suddenly you have the Finno-Ugrian society that has been found up in those regions. It's a completely different language variant. And on top of it, we look at Finland. To this day, we still have the original inhabitants of the Sami that are living there, and we also have the other derivative of the other portions of the Finnish people. All you got to do is look at them, everybody, and then look at what they found in Siberia and everything I've referred to concerning the Saka on top of it. So this I found yesterday because I was not able to find my original source material. For some strange reason, it just vanished. on one of my other texts that I found that actually helped me unlock where this place was. This was not easy. And I stumbled onto this one. And I even on top of it, I just put in just a link real quick, and I just give the top, real brief precursory glance from the Wikipedia on the Oricon inscription. Are two memorial installations erected by the Go-Turks written in Old Turkic alphabet in the 8th century in the Oricon Valley in Mongolia. They were erected in honor of Turkic princes Kultigin and his brother Bilge Kagan. The inscriptions in both Chinese and Old Turkic relate to the legendary origins of the Turks, the golden age of their history, their subjugation by the Chinese, and their liberation by Bilge Kagan. In fact, according to one source, the inscriptions contain rhythmic and parallelistic passages that resemble that of epics. Now, I'm going to stop here, folks. We never mentioned this when we did that program on the Huns and their original origins up in there by China and up through Central Asia. This actually is one of their oldest stories that actually goes back into one of the founding members and the legends associated with this original Hunnic Empire that was there in the steppes and had made several points where they went into China. There's a Disney movie out there, folks, that my wife still watches on and off to this day that tells you that exact same story, which has irony all in of itself because Disney at least recognized that the Huns were there. I don't know why this didn't hit scholarly circles much earlier. Nonetheless, this is one of their legendary accounts. So the fact that they find these connections between Sanskrit, they've got the Old Turkic, you have things going on here with China. Again, back to it. The world was interconnected beyond what our common understanding was. And all of these recent findings that keep coming to light throughout all these sections of the world are going through, and they are proving that beyond any shadow of a doubt. These trade routes were always of vast importance. The world was far more connected than we ever realized. Now, here's we get into some different places. You'll find out on top of it that this same name was also retained much later through the Buddhist text. And that's going to become important. As a matter of fact, there's two different lights that we're going to have to shed on this. The Tibetans, that's going to be a whole different section. There's going to be a lot going on with the Assyrian and with the kings of the East here, because that section with Tibet, they are another portion that goes hand in hand. Actually, not hand in hand. They were rather underhanded with what they did to the people of the Khan Empire and the original Buryat shamans and the varied groups throughout Siberia. At one point in time, they actually were brought in to take the place of the shamans, and they went through and began to meticulously slaughter all of the Siberian people that were with the Khans at this point in time. They were not what we think of as in modern day Tibet, folks. You have to understand that what happened there with this whole place becoming this quote unquote place of Buddhism, that happened way later. These folks were steppe tribes. There was a whole bunch of wars that have went on with Tibet that are actually quite important. But this whole premise and idea of them being tied in with Buddhism, it's much later in history as you would commonly think. And there's so much that goes in there that this is a whole separate program. Because when we talk about sorcerers, folks, remember that. Once again, you go into this, you find out that this Odhyana that's spoken of through these texts within Buddhism, and this goes back into the ones in ancient Gandhara, which is actually where the roots of Buddhism took place, refer to this place as essentially as a green and fertile kingdom. It goes on to further point out a garden surrounded by rugged mountains, broad valleys, and let me point this out real fast, everybody. I've got one of the major historical and archaeological documents out there, one of the books that I purchased quite some time back that I just started diving into very deeply lately. about Gandhara itself and these stupas. What they, it's, you know, these Buddhist places of burial and so forth. It's these big cone-shaped looking buildings. But that's not what they looked like until the time that the Bactrian Greeks, when you had the groups that came in with Alexander during the Seleucid Empire with him, they had slowly changed to get more of your Greek ornamentation and that Greek appearance to it. What those original stupas actually were is it's no different than the Kurgan burials that were found all throughout Central Asia that we had. What found inside of those Kurgan burials? Well, everybody, they're mounds. That might be a big hint to some things happening here in America. That's a deeper topic. Nonetheless, they were mounds, and inside these mounds, they would find your burials of your varied Scythian, a lot of the ones that they have going up towards Siberia, into Kazakhstan and so forth. That's where the Saka themselves were found. Inside of those, you would have their dress, obviously. You'd have the horse sacrifices and all of that. So when we had this Gandhara society, these actual stupas were actually a Kurgan. So that is a little bit of an inside look into why all of a sudden maybe we might want to pay attention here. So they go into quite a few other, in-depth details here concerning Buddhism, but nonetheless, they point out that's exactly what we're dealing with here. This, once again, the scholars have pointed this out. This has been around for quite some time. The original name for that section of that place I just showed you by the Khyber Pass, Adina, actually comes from this name. But it's also known to be part of what they refer to as the Swat district. And this right here, once again, this shows, he comes out and says it, what most of the scholars basically point to. It's the literal garden, Udanya. And this is in, where does it say? Once again, near Khyber, province of Pakistan, Swat River, Hindu Kush Range, etc., etc., etc. This is where understanding the ancient empire of Gandhara really becomes important, because as I'm finding out myself now, which ironically enough, I've had this book sitting there for 2 months and I've been so swamped with working through other books that I had not even got to it. And I just finally started reading it in the last few days. And there's so much about the ancient empire of Gandhara that's crucially important for our understanding of this entirety of this wonderful puzzle that we've been unraveling. So you can see pointing in here just different odds and ends. We have another article that was written here about archaeological sites being neglected. He goes in and points out a few interesting odds and ends in here. For instance, and maybe it's time to point that out too. I made a comment last week, but I have yet to see any scholar connect the Saka Parthian Empire as being one and the same thing. Well, now I have to eat my words, because the author that wrote this book on Gandhara, which is one of the top scholars in that region, he doesn't even mince words. He just automatically puts a slash in there and tells you emphatically it was the Saka Parthian. It changed hands after the Saka Parthian. It went into the hands. We had alternations here. We had it go into the hands of the Scythian, Saka, and then we had it go into the hands of the Kushan Empire, which, guess what, folks? Once again, that was the Saka. Now, why did we have the Magi in this place on a continual basis? This is where you begin to now equate why it was I was already bringing up something very strange. Why were the Magi surrounding Eden? Because here's the evidence, everybody. And since the 1800s, I'm going to say this again, you're going to start understanding that when actually all this material goes into its proper place. You guys are getting previews. This is not even close to the vast amount of work that actually is in reality going to be going into some form of publication, be it documentary or written. I haven't decided yet. Now let's take a look at this place that the ancient people of India, the ancient Buddhists, referred to as, it's not much of a stretch, everybody, to see that they were referring to Eden. It's right there when you start breaking down the language bases. It's sort of impossible to miss. And this is where we're going to look at the first place I brought up. This is Adina in Khyber Pashtun. All right, let's see. I'll say Pashtun, that's where they live to this day. Once again, I've got that marked twice. And let's see, where else do we have? We have to also look at the location of the Swat Valley. What I'd like to do in the future here is actually map out the entirety of Gandhara. So we have that location locked in place. Now let's look here at the Swat district. This moves up further, folks. As you can see, this is actually very extensive. This helps you to understand how big it was that satrapy referred to as bringing all this gold dust forward. At the time of the Persians, throughout all of their text, now you understand how big Gandhara, in a little light of its vastness, it's much larger than this. So now let's start breaking this down, folks. Let's take a look here at the bigger picture. Start to pull these things out and now really get a look. As we zoom out, like I told everybody, this is why the headwaters, that's why these sources become very important. Now we've been able to triangulate. Now we can understand why it's saying it was one river. This top section here is not part of that river. What it is actually the final point that I drew in to sort of center everything for people to see. As it goes down here, down to the south and the west at this angle that I have lined here, and I've got all these rivers and portions of the river with the Pison. That was actually a much trickier one because I had to lock in every location to get its entirety so you could see it on the map. As it goes down southwest, you can see how the waters came out, and then they did what? Okay, they moved across. Now, why is it that I drew the lines in this way? Well, the first river we've got the Pishon source is the first. We're told to look there first. We're given a specific order. Okay, that's where we're told to go first. The source of Pishon. We pull it back up. Now where are we told to look? We're told to look at the Gihon. We have that here. That's the source of the Gihon from ancient times. So, where are we told to go next? Well, we are told a specific order. The next one that is actually mentioned is the Tigris. So now we walk over to the Tigris. That's the source that I know of now. Once again, as I pointed out earlier, I don't know how much this course may have changed. It's possible it could have changed like the other ones. Then we are told next, the Euphrates. So now we pull it out to the Euphrates. We have that source. So let's zoom this back out again, everybody. Take a closer look. Purple lines, that gives you, now we understand a source when it says a river. And I had to break a thought pattern. When I was looking into this, when I was trying to understand what the Lord was telling us here, my mind automatically wanted to think that rivers run from north to south. It was a bit of a bonehead moment once I realized that, wait a minute. No, they don't. They can go north-south, they can go east-west, they can wind all over the place. That was the hardest thing for me to break into understanding what it was that was being said. Once I realized that, then everything made sense. Now look at, if you can see here, when we take the original source of the Gihon, as you go down here, you can literally see these winding rivers coming through. Same goes with all the work that they've already done on tracing the Oxus and all of its spots that have come through. So now we know we had a river going out. It breaks apart and does what? It became the heads of all the rest of the rivers, just like we are specifically told. We're told to go next to the Tigris. We're told to go next to the Euphrates. So now all of a sudden we begin to realize as well, like Matthew pointed out, when we're talking about the land in the midst of the rivers, now we have something much larger. This is why I said before, folks, in order to understand the end, we have to understand the beginning. Without this, there's been a lot of stuff that we've studied prophetically, Matthew and I, even that we just look at and we didn't understand. But now, locking all this in, suddenly this makes absolute sense. I mean, and that's, I don't know if this is showing up in the screen. I'm trying to get it there. Right there, no, folks. I'm hoping this shows up. If this is showing up in the video, indeed, there is a green geographical spot shows up on the map that, as you can take note of, it surrounds this entire region. I had Matthew track this down. I had no idea what I was looking at. All I knew is it surrounded everything. And I just looked at it and said, this cannot be coincidence. That little geographical location that I just referred to is known as the Sistan Basin. This is a map showing what basically is being shown there on Google Earth. And it goes through in details basically everything you need to see there. So I'm going to do one last thing here before I slide it to Matthew. Now I'm going to show everybody something. I'm going to let you see the intensity of what we're looking at here, because it's quite something to behold. Once you bring in the whole picture, Matthew pointed something crucial out. Because let's do something now. Let's go back to the days of Noah. Try to get that as straight as possible. This is Matthew's work that he already had done via exactly what it tells us in Ezekiel 38, verse 12, about Jerusalem shall be at the center. Okay, that's New North. Right here up in Siberia. Now when you look at it from this angle, and then zoom in, starts to make a little bit more sense, doesn't it? Inadvertently, this river did definitely move side in a down slope, didn't it? Without that locked in, it makes it harder to see. And let's take a little trip here. We're gonna first move into the Temple Mount. Let's lock that in. There we have the Temple Mount in Israel. Let's move this way. Now we can see the north. Now we go to the south, the antipode. Let's move to the Pishon, where it tells us to go first. There's the Pishon. Let's go to the Gihon. Tigris. And the Euphrates.
We've now put the linchpin in the trailer of eschatology for sure. Now that we have determined the players involved, now the future is going to make a whole lot more sense when we see it happen right in front of our face. We already know we have major play in the India-Pakistan Kashmir region. That's already at boiling point. Afghanistan, as we speak, American forces are guarding poppy fields there. Iran is seriously in the mix. Russia's in the mix. This is getting ugly, and this is getting ugly quick. But now that we have this location locked in place, now that we can realize from which direction these kings of the East are going to be coming, they're literally going to be hammering down what is called in those old Bible maps the King's Highway, that portion of the Silk Road. With this in mind, it will help us flush out all this garbage from the Christian academic entertainment industry. Just flush all that junk out of your brain. Start doing news scans for these regions, because they're going to come. They have to retrace their steps, don't they? Just like Khan, just like Attila. Everything's going to be put in its place, just like chess pieces. It's already been planned. You know, ladies and gentlemen, it amazes me how people don't realize that the game never changes. Whether it be chess or checkers or tiddlywinks, the game only gets played one way. That's God's way. He's already figured out how he likes it, and that's how we're going to do it. Because there's nothing new under the sun. He wasn't lying to you. That's what he meant. So much to cover, so much to talk about before these things take place. One thing's for sure, they have went way out of the way to make sure that the bride could not perceive what was over the horizon, even though she has been promised to be able to know what is to come. But there's so much garbage in her mind. You know, I was just talking to somebody the other day. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, the last of the prophecies have already come true, that the love of most would wax cold. You know, let's be honest with each other. What's the first thing people do? Let's say there's a terrorist attack at a school. If that school is not the school their own particular children go to, what's the first thing to do? Check the stock market ticker. During the Paris bombings, I mean, I watched several people do it actually. Pulled out their smartphone, checked the stock market ticker. Seeing it happen. There's an earthquake in a major city. What's the first thing to do? Check the stock market ticker. If they hear on the news that the place of employment where their spouse is, something happens, only when it gets really personal, and they check the stock market ticker first, then they call their spouse. Really, you can only get Americans' emotions to set in after they close the stock market. then everybody will pay attention to what's going on. I mean, let's be honest with each other. Hurricane Matthew was coming in. Would everybody watch? Nobody gave a flying rip about the people in Florida or South Carolina, North Carolina. No, they checked the stock market ticker. It's already come true, hasn't it? With that in mind, Brian has provided unto you the beginning. Everything in play. And it's massively important that God says that kings from the east will come once the four riders bound are unleashed. That's the whole reason why the Euphrates River drives up. Is because, like I said, let me say this again. You realize that the Euphrates went right through Babylon. You realized how they marched into Babylon. They dammed up the river and walked underneath the moat because the river went straight through the city. Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah, that's exactly what Darius did. He dammed up the river. Walked right under the wall. Then he walked up to, of course, Marduk, the statue of Marduk, and took Marduk's hands. Yep. You didn't know that was in Bible prophecy? Yeah, it is. Anyway, like I said, you know, the rules of chess don't change. Nope. You know what, though? There's a game I like a whole lot better than chess or checkers. I love Chinese checkers. It's a whole different ball game. As a matter of fact, it is a ball game because you play that with marbles. But I love that game. Brian, that's it for me. I'm going to be signing off here, ladies and gentlemen. It is 20 till 3 in the morning. I'm about ready to fall over. So as far as I'm concerned, ladies and gentlemen, God bless, Godspeed.
We have a lot of new things to consider here, folks. If I had not sat down this week and actually decided that I needed to reevaluate this entire picture, we would not have what we have now. So look over the material, folks. This is only but a portion. This is only but a portion, and the rest of it's not going to see the light of day for a while. This has to be done properly. I've been working on this for more years than I would even care to mention. Folks, this is a large, large, large project. Thanks for joining us, everyone. God bless.